The morning mist in Santa Fe wrapped the adobe streets in a sleepy embrace, as if the ancient town itself was holding its breath. Verena Martinez clutched her worn leather purse closer to her chest as she stepped through the glass door of Adobe Animal Clinic, the familiar scent of antiseptic and lavender calming spray greeting her like an old friend. At 68, she had learned to find comfort in routine. Tuesday mornings were for picking up Esperanza's arthritis medication, just as Wednesday. Evenings were for Vespers at St. Francis Cathedral. The waiting room buzzed with its usual symphony. A young mother cooing to a carrier holding what sounded like a very displeased parakeet, an elderly gentleman reading a newspaper with his ancient beagle snoring at his feet, and somewhere in the background, the soft murmur of Dr. Elena Vasquez speaking in hushed tones. "Mrs. Martinez, I have Esperanza's prescription ready," called Maria, the receptionist, her voice carrying the warmth that had made this clinic feel like a second home to Verena over the past 3 years. Ever since Elias had passed, these small interactions had become precious threads in the fabric of her increasingly quiet days. As Verena approached the counter, a door opened behind her, and she heard Dr. Vasquez's voice, heavier than usual. "Mr. Peterson, are you absolutely certain about this decision?" Verena glanced over her shoulder and saw an elderly man with silver hair and trembling hands, his weathered face etched with a pain she recognized all too well, the look of someone forced to make an impossible choice. Beside him stood Dr. Vasquez, holding a syringe with the careful reverence of someone about to end a life. 15 years, Doc," the man whispered, his voice cracking. "Ashby's been my shadow for 15 years, but I can't watch him suffer anymore, and I can't afford—" On the examination table lay a dog that might have once been magnificent. His coat, a mixture of grey and faded. Brown spoke of countless adventures and lazy afternoons in the sun, but now his breathing was labored, shallow, and his eyes, those deep amber eyes, were clouded with pain and the weariness that comes with fighting a battle you're destined to lose. Verena found herself frozen, her hand halfway to her purse. There was something about this scene that pulled at a place in her heart she thought had gone numb 6 months ago when Elias drew his last breath in their bedroom, surrounded by 45 years of shared memories. Dr. Vasquez prepared to approach the table when something extraordinary happened. The dog, who had been motionless for what seemed like hours, slowly turned his great head toward the sound of Verena's breathing. Their eyes met across the small room, and in that instant something shifted in the universe, or at least in the small universe of that veterinary clinic. Ashby, with tremendous effort, lifted one trembling paw toward Verena and let out a sound that wasn't quite. A whimper, wasn't quite a plea, but somehow managed to be both. It was the sound of a soul reaching across the divide between species, between strangers, seeking connection in its darkest hour. Verena's breath caught in her throat. The purse slipped from her fingers, landing with a soft thud on the linoleum floor. Without conscious thought, she stepped forward, her orthopedic shoes making small squeaking sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly silent room. "Wait," she heard herself say, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Please, just wait." Dr. Vasquez lowered the syringe, her dark eyes questioning. Mr. Peterson looked up with a mixture of hope and confusion. Maria stopped typing at her computer. Even the parakeet seemed to pause its protests. Verena approached the examination table and, with infinite gentleness, took the outstretched paw in her own weathered hands. The paw was warm, surprisingly strong despite its tremor, and she could feel the faintest pulse of life coursing through it. "What's actually wrong with him?" she asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Mr. Peterson's story unfolded like a familiar tragedy. Ashby, a rescue who had been his constant companion through retirement, divorce, the loss of his brother, and countless quiet evenings watching television together. The degenerative hip dysplasia that had started as a slight limp. The treatments that had grown more expensive as his fixed income grew smaller. The painful decision that no amount of love could make easier. "I got him when he was just 2, Mr. Peterson said, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Found him at the shelter, all scared and skinny. He was afraid of men back then. Someone had hurt him real bad, but somehow we just understood each other." Verena continued to hold Ashby's paw, feeling the warmth of life pulsing against her palm. She thought of Esperanza, her calico cat, waiting at home in their empty house. Esperanza, who had been Elias's cat first, had taken to following Verena from room to room since his death, as if she too felt the weight of silence that had settled over their home like dust on unused furniture. "The treatments," Verena said quietly. "How much would they cost?" Dr. Vasquez exchanged a glance with Mr. Peterson. "Mrs. Martinez, the physical therapy alone would be several $100s a month, plus medications, special diet, regular checkups. And if he had all that," Verena pressed, "what would his quality of life be like?" "With dedication and the right care," Dr. Vasquez said carefully, "dogs with his condition can live comfortably for years. But it requires daily attention, patience, and yes, significant financial commitment." The room fell silent again, except for Ashby's labored breathing and the distant sound of traffic on Paseo de Peralta. Verena looked into those amber eyes again and saw something she hadn't expected to see. Not just pain, but hope. Not just resignation, but a flicker of the dog he used to be. In that moment, she made a decision that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone in that room and eventually their entire community. "What if I helped pay for his treatment?" she said, the words coming out in a rush. "And if Mr. Peterson needs assistance with his daily care, what if I could help with that too?" The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Vasquez set the syringe down completely. Mr. Peterson's mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Even Ashby seemed to sense the shift in the room's energy, his breathing becoming slightly less labored. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Vasquez said gently, "that's an incredibly generous offer. But caring for a dog with Ashby's condition is a full-time commitment. Are you sure you understand what you're suggesting?" Verena thought of her house, where every room echoed with memories of Elias. She thought of her days, structured around avoiding the silence, morning mass, grocery shopping, lunch alone while reading the same paragraph of her book 3 times, afternoon naps that felt more like practice for something she wasn't ready for yet. "I lost my husband 6 months ago," she said quietly, still holding Ashby's paw. "Our house feels like a museum now. Maybe we could help each other." What happened next would be remembered by everyone in that room for the rest of their lives. Ashby, with enormous effort, lifted his head and gently licked Verena's hand. It was a gesture so tender, so full of gratitude and recognition, that even Maria had to reach for the tissues. But there was still the question of logistics, of practical matters that couldn't be solved by good intentions alone. Mr. Peterson, his voice thick with emotion, explained that his arthritis made it difficult for him to help Ashby with the physical therapy he would need. His small apartment had stairs, and he worried about leaving Ashby alone during his own medical appointments. "What if," Verena said, the idea forming as she spoke, "what if Ashby came to stay with me, at least during his recovery? My house is all on one level, I have a yard, and—" She paused, thinking of Esperanza. "And I have experience caring for animals who need extra attention." The proposal hung in the air like incense, waiting to see if it would be blessed or dismissed. Dr. Vasquez, who had been practicing veterinary medicine for 15 years, had seen many generous gestures, but this felt different. This felt like destiny intervening in the most ordinary of moments. "Mr. Peterson," she said gently, "ultimately, this is your decision, but I will say that Ashby's response to Mrs. Martinez is unprecedented. In all my years, I've never seen a dog respond to a stranger the way he just responded to her." Mr. Peterson looked at his old friend, lying on the table with his paw still gently held in Verena's hands. He thought of his empty apartment, of his own struggles with mobility, of the guilt that had been eating at him for weeks as he watched Ashby decline. "Ashby," he whispered, leaning close to the dog's face, "what do you think, old boy? Would you like that?" As if he understood every word, and perhaps he did, Ashby managed a small wag of his tail and looked between his old master and his potential new guardian. In that look was a lifetime of trust, a willingness to begin again, and perhaps most importantly, forgiveness for the impossible. Choice his beloved human had been forced to make. If you're really sure, ma'am," Mr. Peterson said, his voice barely above a whisper, "then maybe this is what's meant to be." Dr. Vasquez began discussing immediate treatment plans, medication schedules, and the importance of gradual transitions for senior dogs, but Verena heard it all through a strange, warm fog of something she hadn't felt in months: purpose. As she filled out paperwork and listened to detailed care instructions, She found herself thinking of Esperanza waiting at home. How would her independent calico cat react to sharing their quiet space with a large, ailing dog? Esperanza had been Elias's special companion, choosing to sleep on his side of the bed long after he was gone, as if keeping watch over memories only she could see. But somehow, Verena sensed that this too would work itself out. After all, both Esperanza and Ashby were creatures who had learned to find comfort in the midst of loss. Maybe that would be enough to build understanding between them. An hour later, as Verena gently helped Ashby into the back seat of her old Honda, she caught Mr. Peterson's eye. He was standing on the sidewalk, looking lost and relieved and heartbroken all at once. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving us both a second chance." As Verena drove home through the narrow streets of Santa Fe, she glanced in her rearview mirror at Ashby, who had fallen asleep almost immediately, perhaps for the first time in weeks without pain medication. She thought about the morning that had started so ordinarily, a simple trip to pick up cat medication, and how it had transformed into something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. But beginnings, she knew, were often the easiest part. The real work would start when they got home, when the reality of caring for a sick dog met the fantasy of healing they had created in that examination room. She thought of all the things that could go wrong, all the ways this generous impulse might crumble under the weight of daily reality. Still, as she pulled into her driveway and saw Esperanza watching from the front window, her green eyes alert and curious, Verena felt something she hadn't experienced in months: anticipation for tomorrow. What none of them could have predicted was how this single act of compassion would ripple outward, touching lives they had never imagined, transforming not just a woman and her new companion, but an entire community that had forgotten how powerful simple kindness could be. But that story would unfold one day at a time, beginning tomorrow, when Verena would wake up to discover that saying yes to love always means saying yes to the unknown. The first night was a revelation in all the ways Verena hadn't expected. She had prepared the sunroom for Ashby, laying out soft blankets and placing his food and water bowls on the terracotta tiles where the morning light would warm them. But when she awoke at 3 in the morning to check on him, she found him lying in the hallway outside her bedroom door, his amber eyes reflecting the nightlight like two small moons. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, kneeling beside him in her faded pink nightgown. "Are you in pain?" Ashby's tail attempted a weak wag, but his eyes held something deeper than physical discomfort. Verena recognized it because she had seen it in her own mirror for the past 6 months. The look of someone afraid to sleep alone with their grief. Esperanza appeared at the bedroom doorway, her calico fur standing slightly on end, as she assessed this large intruder in their home. For a moment, the three of them created a tableau of uncertainty. Woman, cat, and dog, each carrying their own stories of loss and weariness. Then Esperanza did something that surprised them all. She approached Ashby slowly, her green eyes fixed on his face, and after a moment of careful consideration, she touched her pink nose to his black one. It was the briefest of contacts, but it seemed to say, "We're all refugees here." By morning, Verena had moved Ashby's bed into her room, positioning it near the window where he could watch the sunrise paint the Sangre de Cristo mountains gold and rose. Esperanza claimed the foot of the bed, creating what looked like a small parliament of healing creatures, each keeping watch over the others. But the challenges of caring for Ashby revealed themselves quickly. The medications Dr. Vasquez had prescribed came with a schedule more complex than anything Verena had managed since Elias's final months. Anti-inflammatories with food, joint supplements on an empty stomach, pain medication every 8 hours, but never with the stomach protectant, which had to be given separately. More troubling was Ashby's refusal to eat. For 3 days he turned away from every offering: premium senior dog food, boiled chicken, even the special treats Mr. Peterson had sent along. Verena found herself sitting on the kitchen floor, trying to hand-feed him small pieces of plain rice, her worry growing with each refused morsel. "He's grieving," Dr. Vasquez explained during a check-in call. "Dogs form profound attachments. Changing homes, even to loving ones, can affect appetite. But he can't go much longer without eating properly." That evening, as Verena sat beside Ashby's bed watching him sleep fitfully, she remembered something her grandmother had told her years ago about treating sick animals on their farm in Taos. "Mija," her abuela had said in her mixture of Spanish and English. Sometimes the body needs medicine, but the spirit needs something different. The old ways, they knew about feeding the spirit too. The memory sent Verena to her kitchen, where she pulled out a notebook filled with her grandmother's recipes, most written in Spanish, many faded with time. She found what she was looking for on a page stained with decades-old chocolate: caldo para animalitos enfermos, broth for sick little animals. The next morning, Verena drove to the Santa Fe farmers market, where vendors had been gathering every Saturday since before her grandmother's time. The market bustled with early autumn energy, chili roasters filling the air with smoky sweetness, mariachi music drifting from the food trucks, families speaking in the comfortable bilingual flow that made Santa Fe feel like home. She was studying a display of fresh herbs, trying to remember which ones her grandmother had used, when a gentle voice spoke behind her, looking for something to heal the spirit as well as the body. Verena turned to find a woman about her own age, with silver-streaked hair braided down her back and eyes the color of sage. Her booth was filled with herbs Verena didn't recognize, and bundles of plants that seemed to carry the essence of the high desert in their very fibers. "I have a dog," Verena began, then found herself telling this stranger the entire story: the clinic, the decision, Ashby's refusal to eat, her worry that she had bitten off more than she could chew. The woman, who introduced herself as Ruth Yazzie, listened with the patience of someone accustomed to hearing the weight of other people's hearts. When Verena finished, Ruth nodded slowly. "Your grandmother's recipe," she said. "It would have used what grew where she grew. But this land has its own medicines, and animals they know. They can sense when something is made with the right intention." Ruth moved among her herbs with practiced ease, selecting small amounts of this and that: chamomile for calming, a touch of wild mint for digestion, juniper berries that had been gathered with ceremony. She explained each choice, but Verena sensed there was more to this selection than botanical knowledge. "Cook this slow," Ruth instructed, wrapping the herbs in brown paper. "Let it simmer until your kitchen smells like healing, and when you give it to him, tell him it's okay to stay. Sometimes they need permission to stop." Waiting for their old life to come back, the drive home took Verena through the plaza, where tourists photographed the palace of the governors and children chased pigeons around the central garden. She found herself seeing the familiar sights through new eyes, as if caring for Ashby had awakened her to nuances of daily life she had missed during her months of sleepwalking through grief. At home, she prepared Ruth's broth with the kind of attention she had once given to Elias's special meals. During his illness, the kitchen filled with an aroma that was both foreign and familiar, earthy and comforting, carrying hints of rain and mountain meadows. When she knelt beside Ashby with the cooled broth, Esperanza appeared beside her, as if she too understood this was an important moment. Verena held the bowl close to Ashby's nose, letting him catch the scent. "Ashby," she said softly, using the tone she had once used to comfort Elias during his worst nights, "you're home now. It's okay to stay. It's okay to get better." Whether it was the herbs, the intention, or simply the fact that Ashby was finally ready to trust this new reality, he lifted his head and began to drink, slowly at first, then with growing eagerness, as if he had suddenly remembered he was hungry for more than just food. By evening he had eaten a small portion of his regular food mixed with the broth. By the next morning, he was standing by his food bowl, tail wagging weakly but unmistakably. Dr. Vasquez was amazed by the change when Verena called to report Ashby's progress. "Whatever you're doing," she said, "keep doing it. I've seen dogs recover from surgery faster than I've seen them recover from heartbreak." But even as Ashby's appetite returned, other challenges emerged. His hind legs remained weak, making it difficult for him to rise from lying down. The physical therapy exercises Dr. Vasquez had demonstrated seemed to cause him pain, despite the medications. Verena found herself lifting his hindquarters to help him stand, supporting his weight as he walked slowly around the yard. It was during one of these assisted walks that she met her neighbor Naomi Chen, who was working in her garden next door. Verena had waved to Naomi over the fence for 3 years, but had never really talked to her, one of those neighborhood relationships that existed in smiles and friendly nods rather than actual conversation. "That's quite a commitment you've taken on," Naomi said, looking at Ashby with the kind of understanding that suggested personal experience. "Some days I wonder if I've lost my mind," Verena admitted, then felt disloyal to Ashby for saying it. Naomi laughed, a sound like wind chimes. I used to teach yoga before I moved here from Oregon. Part of why I came to Santa Fe was to figure out what comes after a life of teaching people to stretch their bodies. I've been converting my studio space into something more holistic. She gestured toward what Verena had always assumed was just an elaborate garden shed. I've been working on creating a space for aqua yoga, gentle movement in warm water. It's supposed to be for humans, but she paused, studying Ashby. Water therapy can be incredibly healing for dogs with joint issues. If you're interested, we could try it. Verena felt that same flutter of possibility she had experienced in the veterinary clinic. Are you serious? I'm a former yoga instructor whose entire life philosophy is based on the belief that healing comes in unexpected packages, Naomi said with a grin. Of course I'm serious. 2 days later, Verena found herself beside a small, warm pool in what had indeed once been a garden shed, but was now something between a greenhouse and a sanctuary. Plants climbed the walls, soft music played from hidden speakers, and the water maintained a temperature that felt like a liquid hug. Getting Ashby into the pool required patience and 3 different attempts, but once he was floating with Naomi's expert support, something magical happened. The weight that had been crushing his joints was suddenly lifted, and for the first time in months, he moved his legs freely, almost swimming, his face expressing something that looked remarkably like joy. It's like watching him remember who he used to be, Verena whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. After that, Tuesdays and Fridays became aqua therapy days. Ashby began to look forward to these sessions, his tail wagging with more enthusiasm as they approached Naomi's converted studio, and slowly, the improvements became visible. He could stand on his own more easily. His walks around the yard grew longer. Most importantly, the light in his amber eyes grew brighter each day. But perhaps the most unexpected development was the friendship blooming between Verena and Naomi. Their conversations during Ashby's therapy sessions revealed kindred spirits, 2 women who had found themselves at transition points, figuring out what purpose looked like in the second half of life. I spent 30 years teaching people to find balance, Naomi confided one afternoon as they watched Ashby paddle contentedly around the pool. But I'm just now learning what balance actually means. It's not about being centered all the time, it's about knowing how to recover when life knocks you sideways. Verena thought about this as she helped Ashby out of the pool, his coat dark and sleek from the water, his movements more confident than they had been in weeks. She was learning that recovery wasn't a straight line. It was more like a spiral, circling back through pain and progress, grief and healing, sometimes on the same day. At home that evening, as she prepared Ashby's dinner with a generous serving of Ruth's healing broth, Verena realized that her house felt different, not just because it now contained a dog and smelled faintly of herbal medicine, but because it had become a place where healing happened, where each day brought small victories worth celebrating. Esperanza seemed to sense the change too. She had begun joining them for their evening rituals, sitting nearby as Verena massaged Ashby's joints with the special cream Dr. Vasquez had recommended. Sometimes she would even groom Ashby's ears with her rough pink tongue, as if she had appointed herself assistant nurse in their small rehabilitation center. That night, as Verena settled into bed with Esperanza, curled against her legs, and Ashby sleeping peacefully on his bed nearby, she felt something she had thought was lost forever: contentment. Not the desperate happiness she had tried to force during her worst grieving days, but a quiet satisfaction with the day that had passed, and gentle anticipation for the day to come. But contentment, Verena was about to learn, was not the same as security. Life had more tests waiting for them, challenges that would push their small circle of healing to its limits and force her to discover reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. As she drifted off to sleep, Ashby lifted his head and looked toward the window, where shadows moved differently than they had in his old home. But instead of the anxiety that had kept him awake those first few nights, he felt only curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. For the first time in months, tomorrow felt like something worth waiting for. What none of them could foresee was that their small miracle of recovery was about to face its greatest challenge. Yet, one that would test not just Ashby's growing strength, but the depth of the connections they had all begun to depend on. 3 weeks into November, Santa Fe mornings carried the crisp promise of winter. Verena had developed a new routine that felt both foreign and natural. Wake at 6 to let Ashby out for his careful morning walk, prepare his breakfast with Ruth's healing broth, check his joints for swelling, and administer his morning medications. It was more structured than her life had been since Elias's death, and she found comfort in being needed again. Ashby's progress had been steady. His appetite was robust, his coat was developing a healthier sheen, and his swimming sessions with Naomi had strengthened his hindquarters considerably. But it was the smaller changes that filled Verena with the most hope. The way he now greeted her each morning with a gentle nudge of his nose against her hand, how he had claimed the sunny spot by the living room window as his own, and most remarkably, how he had begun to play, carefully and briefly, but play nonetheless, with a tennis ball Esperanza had mysteriously produced from some hidden cache of forgotten toys. Dr. Vasquez was pleased with his progress during his 2-week checkup. "Whatever you're doing," she told Verena, "keep doing it. His mobility has improved significantly, and more importantly, he's gained back the weight he'd lost. Dogs don't recover from depression the way he has without feeling genuinely loved." It was this growing confidence that made what happened on Thanksgiving week so devastating. Verena had been walking Ashby through the plaza, their usual route that took them past the Palace of the Governors and around the Central Park. It was their longest walk yet, nearly 15 minutes of steady movement that would have been impossible just a month before. Ashby was enjoying the autumn sunshine, stopping to sniff interesting spots, his tail maintaining a gentle wag that spoke of contentment. They were crossing Palace Avenue when it happened. A car backfired somewhere nearby, a sharp, unexpected crack that shattered the peaceful morning. Ashby startled violently, tried to pivot too quickly, and simply collapsed. One moment he was walking confidently beside her, the next he was lying on the sidewalk, his breathing rapid and shallow, his amber eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Ashby!" Verena knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she checked for obvious injuries. He was conscious, alert, but when he tried to stand, his hind legs wouldn't support him. The strength that had been building so carefully over weeks seemed to have vanished in an instant. A small crowd gathered, tourists and locals alike, drawn by the sight of an elderly woman and her fallen dog. Someone called for a veterinarian, someone else brought water, and a kind man with a pickup truck offered to drive them to the clinic. Through it all, Ashby lay on the sidewalk, looking up at Verena with eyes that seemed to ask, "Did I do something wrong?" Dr. Vasquez's examination was thorough, but her expression grew increasingly grave. X-rays revealed that the sudden movement had aggravated the arthritis in Ashby's spine, creating inflammation that was pressing on nerves. The progress they had celebrated just days before seemed suddenly fragile, temporary. "The good news," Dr. Vasquez explained carefully, "is that this appears to be a setback, not a permanent regression, but he's going to need complete rest for at least a week, possibly 2. No walking beyond what's absolutely necessary, no swimming, certainly no playing." She paused, and Verena recognized the look she had seen in doctors' faces during Elias's illness, the expression of someone preparing to deliver difficult truth. "Mrs. Martinez, I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this might be a pattern. Dogs with degenerative conditions can have good weeks and bad weeks. Today doesn't erase the progress he's made, but it's a reminder that his condition is chronic. There will likely be more setbacks." Driving home with Ashby lying motionless in the back seat, Verena felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling over her like a cold fog. How many times had she sat in hospital parking lots with Elias, processing similar conversations about chronic conditions and uncertain prognoses? How many times had hope and despair chased each other through her heart like competing storms? At home, she helped Ashby to his bed, where he lay with an expression of defeat that broke her heart. Esperanza appeared immediately, as if she had sensed the crisis, and settled herself next to Ashby with the dedication of a nurse taking a shift. But even her comforting presence couldn't lift the cloud that had settled over their small household. That evening, Naomi appeared at the door with a casserole and the kind of practical sympathy that Verena had learned to treasure. "Setbacks are part of healing," she said, as they sat in the living room, speaking in low voices while Ashby slept. "In yoga, we call it the spiral path. You circle back through the same challenges at different levels. It feels like you're going backward, but you're actually going deeper. What if this is as good as it gets for him? Verena asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest all day. What if I've been fooling myself about how much better he could get? Naomi was quiet for a long moment, watching Ashby's steady breathing. What if you have, she said finally. What if this is as good as it gets? Does that change whether what you're doing matters? The question hung in the air between them, challenging and comforting at the same time. Verena thought about the past month, not just Ashby's physical improvements, but the way their home had come alive again. The conversations with Ruth at the farmer's market, the friendship with Naomi, the sense of purpose that had replaced the aimless drifting of early grief. No, she said, quietly, I guess it doesn't. The next few days tested that conviction. Ashby remained subdued, showing little interest in food and none in movement beyond what was absolutely necessary. Even Ruth's healing broth couldn't tempt him to more than a few half-hearted laps. Verena found herself back in the role of anxious caregiver, watching for signs of improvement while trying not to project her own fears onto his recovery. It was Esperanza who provided the breakthrough, in her own mysterious, feline way. On the third day of Ashby's confinement, Verena woke to find both animals missing from their usual sleeping spots. Following the sound of soft rustling, she discovered them in the sunroom. Esperanza had somehow managed to drag her favorite catnip mouse to Ashby's bed, where she was playing an elaborate solo game of hunt and pounce, mere inches from his nose. The performance was so ridiculous. This dignified calico cat behaving like a kitten while a 70-pound dog watched with what could only be described as amusement, that even Verena had to laugh, and when Ashby's tail gave the faintest wag, she knew they had turned a corner. Recovery, she was learning, rarely happened the way you expected it to. Dr. Vasquez was cautiously optimistic when they returned for a follow-up examination. The inflammation had reduced, and while Ashby's mobility was still limited, his spirit seemed improved. But she had a suggestion that would challenge everything Verena thought she knew about. Getting better. There's a holistic veterinarian in Denver, she said, Dr. Julian Monroe. He specializes in cases like Ashby's, chronic conditions in senior dogs. He uses a combination of traditional medicine and alternative therapies that have shown remarkable results. I think it might be worth a consultation. Denver, a 3-hour drive from Santa Fe through mountain passes that could be treacherous in late November. Verena hadn't driven that far since before Elias got sick, hadn't stayed overnight anywhere but her own bed since his funeral. The idea filled her with anxiety that had nothing to do with Ashby's condition and everything to do with her own carefully constructed boundaries. I don't know, she said, surprising herself with her reluctance. It seems like such a big step. Mrs. Martinez, Dr. Vasquez said gently, sometimes healing requires us to go outside our comfort zones. And honestly, if anyone can help Ashby achieve his full potential, it's Dr. Monroe. That night, Verena sat in her living room with a cup of chamomile tea, watching Ashby sleep and wrestling with her own resistance. She had built her life since Elias's death around manageable routines, predictable days, the safety of familiar boundaries. Caring for Ashby had already pushed those boundaries considerably. How much more expansion could her carefully reconstructed world handle? The answer came from an unexpected source. As she was getting ready for bed, the phone rang. It was Mr. Peterson, calling for his weekly check on Ashby's progress. How's our boy doing? He asked, and Verena found herself telling him about the setback, the Denver veterinarian, her own uncertainty about such a big step. You know, Mr. Peterson said when she finished, I've been thinking a lot about decisions lately, about the difference between the ones we make from love and the ones we make from fear. That day in the clinic, when you stepped forward, that was love. It changed everything for all of us. After they hung up, Verena stood at her bedroom window looking out at the lights of Santa Fe below. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, paralyzed by grief, afraid of tomorrow, shrinking her world down to its smallest possible dimensions. Then she thought about the woman who had walked into that veterinary clinic, who had somehow found the courage to disrupt a life that was dying as surely as the dog on that table. What do you think, Ashby? She asked softly. He lifted his head from his bed, those amber eyes alert despite the late hour. Are you up for an adventure? His tail wagged once, definitively, and Verena knew her answer. The next morning, She called Dr. Monroe's office and scheduled an appointment for the following week. Then she called Naomi to arrange care for Esperanza, and Ruth to ask if she had any traveling herbs for dogs with joint pain. Finally, she called her mechanic to make sure her Honda was ready for mountain driving. Each phone call felt like casting a vote for possibility over safety, for hope over resignation. By evening, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before Elias got sick. The anticipation that comes with planning for a future that might be different from what you've imagined. But as she helped Ashby with his evening exercises, gentle stretches that Dr. Vasquez had cleared him to resume, she had no idea that this journey to Denver would bring more than just veterinary expertise. It would introduce them to someone whose own story of resilience would add another thread to the tapestry of healing they were weaving together. Sometimes the very thing we think we're not ready for turns out to be exactly what we need. Verena was about to discover that the highway to healing often runs through territories we never planned to explore. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline sky that made the Sangre de Cristo Mountains look close enough to touch. Verena had packed the Honda with the nervous thoroughness of someone who hasn't traveled far from home in months, Ashby's medications in a labeled container, his special food, the healing herbs Ruth had prepared for the journey, extra blankets, and enough water for a cross-country expedition rather than a 3-hour drive. Esperanza had stationed herself by the front door at sunrise, apparently determined to oversee the departure preparations with the gravity of a ship's captain seeing off an important voyage. She had spent the previous evening methodically grooming Ashby's ears, as if preparing him for inspection, and had presented him with her catnip mouse, a gesture that seemed both generous and significant. "Take care of him," Verena whispered to Esperanza before leaving, and was startled when the cat touched her pink nose to Verena's hand in what felt unmistakably like a blessing. Getting Ashby into the car required the careful choreography they had developed over the past weeks, Verena supporting his hindquarters while he gathered the strength to jump up to the back seat, then arranging his special cushion and ensuring he had enough space to lie comfortably. He seemed to understand this was a significant journey, settling into the back seat with an alertness that suggested anticipation rather than anxiety. The drive began through familiar territory, the winding roads north of Santa Fe that led through small villages where adobe houses sat like natural extensions of the red earth. But as they climbed toward the Colorado border, the landscape transformed into something that felt both foreign and magical. Pine forests thick with autumn snow, mountain meadows that stretched toward peaks so dramatic they looked like a child's drawing of what mountains should be. Ashby remained alert for most of the journey, occasionally lifting his head to look out the windows at the passing scenery. There was something about his posture that reminded Verena of the dog he must have been in his younger years, curious, engaged with the world around him. She found herself telling him about the places they were passing, pointing out landmarks like a tour guide, surprised by how good it felt to have a traveling companion again. They were about an hour from Denver when Verena noticed another car pulled over at a scenic overlook. Something about the scene made her slow down. A young woman standing beside an older model sedan, looking uncertain and possibly stranded. Verena had driven past countless broken-down cars over the years, usually with a pang of sympathy but little inclination to stop. Today, perhaps because she was already outside her comfort zone, she found herself pulling over. The young woman was about 25, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of sturdy clothes that suggested someone accustomed to hard work. She looked up as Verena approached, relief evident in her expression. "Car trouble?" Verena asked. "Not exactly," the woman replied, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. "I'm Ivy Martin, second-year vet student at Colorado State. I was driving home to see my family for the holidays when I saw this beautiful overlook and stopped to take pictures. When I got back to my car, it started making this weird sound." She gestured helplessly toward the sedan. "I know enough about animal biology to diagnose a heart murmur, but car engines are a complete mystery." Verena introduced herself and explained their own journey. To see Dr. Monroe. At the mention of the veterinarian's name, Ivy's entire demeanor changed. "Dr. Monroe? I did a rotation with him last summer. He's absolutely brilliant. One of the most innovative holistic practitioners in the country. You're so lucky to get an appointment with him." As they talked, Ivy shared her own story. She was from a small farming community in eastern Colorado, the first in her family to attend college, working her way through veterinary school with a combination of student loans, part-time jobs, and sheer determination. She was passionate about large animal medicine, particularly interested in how traditional healing methods could be integrated with modern veterinary practice. When Verena mentioned Ashby's condition and the journey that had brought them together, Ivy's eyes grew bright with the kind of professional interest that made her seem older than her years. "Would you mind if I took a look at him?" she asked. "I promise I'm not trying to second-guess your veterinarian, but I love meeting dogs who are defying their prognoses." Ashby, who had been watching this conversation from the back seat with the polite attention of a dog accustomed to being the subject of medical discussions, seemed perfectly willing to be examined by this new person. As Ivy ran her hands along his spine and tested his reflexes, her touch carried the confidence of someone who had been born understanding animals. "He's remarkable," she said finally. "I can feel the arthritis, obviously, but his muscle tone is so much better than I'd expect for a dog with his condition. Whatever you've been doing for him is working." They were interrupted by a grinding sound from Ivy's car as she attempted to start it. The engine turned over reluctantly, accompanied by a noise that clearly indicated serious mechanical distress. "That doesn't sound good," Verena observed. Ivy laughed, but there was worry behind it. "My family's expecting me, and I promised to help with farm chores tomorrow, but I think this car might have other plans." Verena found herself making another impulsive decision, the kind that had been reshaping her life ever since that morning in the veterinary clinic. "Why don't you come with us to Denver?" she offered. "We can figure out what to do about your car from there, and honestly, I'd feel more confident having someone with veterinary training along for Ashby's appointment." The gratitude in Ivy's eyes reminded Verena of Ashby's expression in that examination room, the look of someone who had been offered help when they needed it most. An hour later, they were back on the road, Ivy in the passenger seat sharing stories about her veterinary training, while Ashby dozed contentedly in the back. The conversation made the remaining drive pass quickly. Ivy described cases she had worked on, her professor's varying approaches to animal care, and her dreams of eventually returning to rural Colorado to provide large animal services to farming communities that couldn't always afford traditional veterinary care. "Dr. Monroe was the first veterinarian I met who really understood that healing isn't just about medication," she said, as they entered Denver's suburbs. "He taught me that animals are incredibly good at telling us what they need, if we know how to listen." Dr. Monroe's clinic was nothing like the sterile efficiency of most veterinary offices. Located in a converted Victorian house near downtown Denver, it felt more like a healing sanctuary than a medical facility. The waiting room was filled with natural light, comfortable furniture, and the kind of plants that seemed to grow with unusual vigor. Soft music played from hidden speakers, and the air carried hints of lavender, and something else Verena couldn't identify but found deeply calming. Dr. Monroe himself was a surprise, a tall, gentle man in his 50s, with graying hair and hands that moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades learning to communicate through touch. When he knelt to greet Ashby, his approach was so calm and centered that the dog immediately relaxed, as if recognizing a kindred spirit. "Tell me about his journey," Dr. Monroe said as he began his examination, and Verena found herself sharing not just Ashby's medical history, but the entire story. The morning in the clinic, the decision to take him home, the community of healers who had gathered around his recovery. Dr. Monroe listened with the kind of attention that made her feel truly heard, occasionally asking questions that revealed depths of understanding about the emotional aspects of healing that most medical professionals overlooked. "What I'm seeing here," he said finally, "is a dog whose body is responding beautifully to being loved, but his condition is complex enough that I think we can do more than just manage it. I'd like to try a combination of acupuncture, specialized herbal treatments, and some dietary changes that might actually help regenerate some of the damaged cartilage." He turned to include Ivy in the conversation, recognizing her expertise despite her student status. "Have you worked with any of the new research on anti-inflammatory protocols for senior dogs?" What followed was a discussion that felt more like a collaboration than a consultation. Dr. Monroe outlined a treatment plan that was comprehensive but not overwhelming, combining traditional Chinese medicine with cutting-edge nutritional therapy. He demonstrated acupuncture techniques that could be continued at home, prescribed herbal formulations that would complement Ruth's healing broths, and suggested exercises that would build on the aquatherapy Naomi had been providing. "The most important thing to understand," he said as the appointment concluded, "is that healing is rarely a solo journey. Ashby is getting better because he's part of a community that believes in his recovery. Don't underestimate the power of that." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Monroe surprised them with an invitation. "I'm giving a lecture tomorrow morning at the veterinary school about integrative approaches to chronic pain management in senior animals. Ivy, I know you're interested in this field. And Mrs. Martinez, I think you'd find it valuable to understand more about what you're participating in. Would you consider staying overnight and attending?" The invitation hung in the air like an unexpected gift. Verina's first instinct was to decline. She had already pushed her boundaries farther than felt comfortable, and the thought of spending a night away from home made her anxious. But then she looked at Ivy's excited expression and Ashby's calm demeanor and realized that this too might be part of their healing journey. "I think," she said slowly, "that we'd like that very much." That evening, in a hotel room where Ashby settled immediately onto the provided dog bed as if he had been traveling his entire life, Verina called home to check on Esperanza. Naomi reported that the cat was fine, perhaps a little imperious about having the house to herself, but clearly managing the temporary separation with feline dignity. "How are you managing?" Naomi asked, and Verina was surprised to realize that she was not just managing but actually enjoying herself. The anxiety she had expected hadn't materialized. Instead, she felt energized by the new experiences, the conversations with Ivy, the sense of being part of something larger than her own small world. "I think," she told Naomi, "that I'm remembering who I used to be." That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar hotel bed, listening to Ashby's peaceful breathing and Ivy's quiet phone conversation with her family, Verina reflected on how much had changed since that morning in the veterinary clinic. She had thought she was simply saving a dog, but it was becoming clear that the saving was mutual and ongoing. Tomorrow would bring Dr. Monroe's lecture and new insights into the science behind what felt like magic. But tonight, in this temporary sanctuary, where a widow, a vet student, and a recovering dog had found their way to each other, it was enough to rest in the knowledge that healing really was a community effort. The road home would be different from the road that had brought them here, in ways none of them could yet imagine. The lecture hall at Colorado State University's veterinary school hummed with the energy of young minds eager to challenge traditional boundaries. Verina sat between Ivy and Dr. Monroe in the front row, feeling simultaneously out of place and exactly where she belonged. She was easily 30 years older than most of the students, but their shared focus on healing created a connection that transcended age. Dr. Monroe's presentation was titled "Beyond Symptom Management, Creating Healing Communities for Chronic Conditions in Senior Animals." As he began to speak, clicking through slides that showed remarkable before and after photos of dogs like Ashby, Verina realized she was witnessing something revolutionary, disguised as simple common sense. "Traditional veterinary medicine excels at acute care," Dr. Monroe explained to the attentive audience. "We can perform miraculous surgeries, treat infections, manage emergencies, but chronic conditions, particularly in senior animals, require a different approach. They require us to think not just about treating disease, but about creating conditions for healing." He showed a slide of Ashby from that morning, his coat shining, his stance more confident than it had been in months. Verina felt a flutter of pride, as if she were watching her child being honored at a school assembly. "This dog was scheduled for euthanasia 3 months ago," Dr. Monroe continued. "His condition hasn't been cured. Degenerative joint disease doesn't disappear, but he's been given something more powerful than any medication we could prescribe, a reason to heal." A student raised her hand. "Dr. Monroe, can you quantify the impact of what you're calling healing communities? How do we measure hope?" Dr. Monroe smiled, clearly having anticipated this question. "Excellent point. We're beginning to understand the physiological impacts of social support on healing. When animals feel safe, loved, and part of a pack, their cortisol levels decrease. Lower stress hormones mean better immune function, reduced inflammation, improved appetite, and yes, measurably better outcomes for chronic conditions." Ivy leaned over to whisper, "He's talking about you and Ashby." As the lecture continued, Dr. Monroe outlined the theoretical framework behind what Verena had been practicing intuitively. The importance of consistent routine, which she had established with Ashby's medication and exercise schedule. The healing power of purposeful activity, the swimming sessions with Naomi. The role of community support, Ruth's herbal knowledge, Mr. Peterson's ongoing involvement, even Esperanza's companionship. What we're learning, Dr. Monroe said, is that the most powerful healing happens at the intersection of science and love. Not love as sentiment, but love as action. The daily commitment to believing in an animal's capacity for recovery, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. A young man in the back row raised his hand. But Dr. Monroe, isn't there a risk of false hope? Of promising owners outcomes that might not be realistic? The question hung in the lecture hall like a challenge, and Verena found herself leaning forward to hear the response. That's the crucial distinction, Dr. Monroe replied. We're not promising cure, we're facilitating healing. Healing can happen even when cure isn't possible. A dog who lives his remaining months feeling loved, comfortable, and purposeful has been healed in ways that matter more than his diagnostic label. After the lecture, as students clustered around Dr. Monroe with follow-up questions, Ivy turned to Verena with shining eyes. Did you realize you were conducting an advanced clinical trial in community-based healing? Verena laughed. I thought I was just trying to help a dog eat his dinner. That's exactly what makes it so powerful, Ivy said earnestly. You weren't trying to prove a theory. You were just responding to what Ashby needed. But what you created accidentally is what Dr. Monroe has spent years trying to teach veterinarians to do intentionally. They were interrupted by Dr. Monroe, who approached, with several students in tow. Mrs. Martinez, these students are working on research projects related to alternative approaches to chronic pain management. Would you be willing to share Ashby's story with them? Sometimes case studies teach us more than textbooks. What followed was one of the most unexpected experiences of Verena's life, sitting in a veterinary school coffee shop, surrounded by earnest young people taking notes as she described the past 3 months. They asked detailed questions about Ashby's daily routine, his response to different treatments, the role of his support network in his recovery. What made you decide to use aquatherapy? Asked a student studying physical rehabilitation. I didn't decide anything, Verena replied. My neighbor Naomi offered, and it seemed like something worth trying. And the herbal supplements? My grandmother's recipes, adapted by a friend who knows about desert plants. The students exchanged glances, and one of them laughed. You created an integrated treatment plan that combines elements from traditional Chinese medicine, hydrotherapy, nutritional support, and community care, all by following your instincts. Well, Verena said, feeling suddenly self-conscious, when you put it like that, it sounds much more impressive than it felt at the time. Dr. Monroe, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amusement, leaned forward. Mrs. Martinez, that's exactly the point. The most effective healing often happens when we stop overthinking and start responding. You trusted your instincts, remained open to help from others, and most importantly, you never stopped believing that Ashby could get better. As they prepared to leave Denver the next morning, Ivy made a request that surprised them both. Would it be possible for me to visit Ashby next month? I'm doing an independent study on community-based approaches to animal wellness, and I'd love to document his ongoing progress. Plus, she added with a grin, I'd really like to meet this cat who plays therapist. The drive home passed differently than the journey to Denver. There was less anxiety, more conversation, and a sense of carrying important cargo. Not just the new medications and treatment plans Dr. Monroe had provided, but also a deeper understanding of what they had accomplished together. Ashby seemed to sense the homeward direction, showing more alertness as they descended through the mountain passes toward Santa Fe. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Esperanza was waiting at the front window, and Verena could swear the cat's expression showed both relief and approval. That evening, as she prepared Ashby's dinner with the new herbal supplements Dr. Monroe had prescribed, Verena found herself seeing their daily routine through different eyes. What had felt like simple caregiving now revealed itself as a sophisticated healing protocol. The morning walks weren't just exercise, they were community building, as neighbors increasingly stopped to check on Ashby's progress. The swimming sessions weren't just physical therapy, they were creating bonds of friendship that had expanded both her and Naomi's understanding of what was possible in their own lives. Even Ruth's weekly visits to the farmer's market had evolved into consultations about healing that went far beyond Ashby's immediate needs. Last Saturday, Ruth had mentioned that word about Ashby's recovery was spreading among the area's traditional healers who were beginning to share knowledge about animals and herbs that hadn't been discussed in years. "You started something," Ruth had said, selecting particularly potent-looking juniper berries from her collection. "People are remembering old ways of caring. That matters more than just one dog getting better." Dr. Vasquez was amazed by Ashby's continued improvement when they returned for their regular appointment. His blood work showed reduced inflammatory markers. His range of motion had improved significantly, and most remarkably, his overall demeanor reflected a dog who expected good things to happen. "I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 15 years, Dr. Vasquez told Verena, and I've never seen a recovery quite like this. Whatever combination of factors you've assembled, it's working on multiple levels." But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Mr. Peterson, who had been following Ashby's progress through weekly phone calls, asked if he could visit. "I need to see for myself," he said when he called to arrange the visit. "I need to know I made the right decision that day." When Mr. Peterson arrived the following Saturday, the reunion between him and Ashby was everything Verena had hoped it would be. Ashby's recognition was immediate and joyful, his tail wagging with more vigor than she had seen since his recovery began. But what moved her most was Mr. Peterson's reaction. "Look at you, old boy," he whispered, kneeling to accept Ashby's gentle kisses. "Look how strong you are." They spent the afternoon in Verena's backyard, Mr. Peterson sharing stories about Ashby's younger years while the dog dozed contentedly between them. Esperanza, in an unprecedented display of social grace, actually climbed onto Mr. Peterson's lap and allowed herself to be petted. "You gave me the greatest gift," Mr. Peterson told Verena as he prepared to leave. "You let me say goodbye the right way. Instead of ending with sadness, our story gets to continue with hope." That night, as Verena settled into her evening routine of medicating Ashby and preparing for the next day, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. The house that had felt like a mausoleum now buzzed with activity and purpose. Her social circle had expanded from nearly zero to a network of people united by their commitment to healing. Most importantly, she had rediscovered something she thought she had lost forever: the ability to make a difference. But as often happens when life begins to feel stable and purposeful, a new challenge was approaching, one that would test not just Ashby's continued recovery, but Verena's own resilience and the strength of the community they had built around their shared commitment to hope. The phone call that would change everything was still 3 days away, but already the universe was arranging the circumstances that would push their small healing community to its limits and reveal depths of connection none of them had imagined possible. The call came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning, shattering Verena's peaceful sleep with the jarring insistence of medical emergency. She fumbled for the phone, instantly awake with the kind of adrenaline that mothers and caregivers develop, the ability to go from deep sleep to full alertness in the space between the first and second ring. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from Presbyterian Hospital. You're listed as the emergency contact for Maria Santos." It took Verena a moment to place the name. Then she remembered Maria Santos was Ruth's legal name. Ruth, who had become such a steady presence in their lives over the past months, bringing herbs and wisdom and the kind of practical spirituality that made healing feel possible. "She was brought in about an hour ago," Dr. Chen continued. "She collapsed at home. We've stabilized her, but she's asking for you. She seems quite agitated about some animals in her care." Verena was dressed and in the car within 15 minutes, her mind racing through the implications. If Ruth was hospitalized, who would take care of her animals? Ruth lived alone on a small property outside of town, where she kept chickens, goats, and an ancient horse named Cielo, who had been retired from trail riding, but still required daily care. At the hospital, she found Ruth in a bed that seemed too large for her small frame, looking diminished but alert. Her silver braids had been loosely contained by a hospital hair tie, and her dark eyes held the frustrated urgency of someone accustomed to taking care of others, suddenly finding herself the one needing care. "Verena," Ruth said, reaching for her hand with surprising strength. "Thank goodness. I need you to call my neighbor, Miguel Torres. His number is in my phone. The animals need their morning feed and Cielo needs his arthritis medication." "Ruth, slow down," Verena said gently. "What happened? Are you all right?" Diagnosis was pneumonia, serious but treatable, especially since Ruth had been brought in early. But she would need to stay in the hospital for at least a week, possibly longer, depending on how she responded to treatment. "I can't leave them alone that long," Ruth said, struggling to sit up despite the nurse's gentle protests. "Miguel helps when he can, but he works 2 jobs. And Cielo, he's 28 years old. He needs someone who understands." Verena found herself making another of those decisions that had been reshaping her life since that morning in the veterinary clinic. "What if I help?" she offered. "I could drive out morning and evening, make sure everyone's fed and cared for. I've never handled goats or chickens, but I can learn." The relief in Ruth's eyes was immediate and profound. "You would do that?" "Of course I would. You've been taking care of Ashby for months. This is what friends do." But as Verena drove home to collect supplies for what would be a week of intensive animal care, she realized she had underestimated the complexity of what she had volunteered for. Ruth's property was 45 minutes outside of Santa Fe, which meant she would be making the round trip twice daily. She would need to arrange care for Ashby during her absences, and she had no experience with farm animals beyond childhood memories of visiting her grandmother's place in Taos. The solution, when it came, demonstrated the power of the community that had grown around. Ashby's recovery. Naomi immediately offered to adjust her schedule to include extra swimming sessions for Ashby, ensuring he wouldn't miss his physical therapy during Verena's absences. Ivy, who was visiting that week to observe Ashby's progress for her independent study, volunteered to stay at the house and provide medical oversight for his care. "I grew up on a ranch," Ivy reminded Verena. "I know my way around chickens and goats. Let me come with you and help." Dr. Vasquez, when consulted about adjusting Ashby's schedule to accommodate the crisis, surprised everyone by offering to make house calls if needed. "Ruth has been providing herbal support for several of my patients," she said. "This is the least I can do." Even Mr. Peterson called to offer help, though his own mobility limitations meant his contribution would be more emotional than practical. "If you need someone to sit with Ashby while you're gone, I'm available," he said. "It would do my heart good to spend time with him." Ruth's property turned out to be a small paradise of sustainable living. Her adobe house sat in a natural depression, surrounded by hills covered with piñon and juniper trees. The animal enclosures were thoughtfully designed to provide shelter while allowing the creatures to move freely. Gardens showed evidence of years of careful cultivation, with herb beds arranged according to principles Verena didn't understand but could sense were important. Cielo, the elderly horse, greeted them with the dignity of a retired diplomat. His grey coat showed his age, but his eyes held the gentle intelligence of an animal who had spent decades learning to trust humans. When Ivy examined him, her veterinary training evident in her careful assessment of his joints and overall condition, he stood patiently, as if he understood the importance of the inspection. "He's in remarkable shape for his age," Ivy reported. "Ruth's been taking excellent care of him." The chickens were another matter entirely. Verena had expected them to be simple: scatter food, collect eggs, close the coop at night. But Ruth's flock had clearly developed opinions about their daily routine that brooked no deviation. They gathered around the feed bucket with the demanding enthusiasm of dinner theatre critics, and their egg-laying schedule was apparently negotiable based on factors Verena couldn't begin to understand. "They're just asserting their personalities," Ivy said, laughing as a particularly imperious hen pecked at Verena's shoelaces. "Chickens are much more intelligent than most people realize. The goats, 3 females named Luna, Estrella, and Esperanza, after Verena's cat, Ruth had explained with a smile during one of their farmers' market conversations, were simultaneously the easiest and most challenging animals to care for. They required little beyond hay, water, and mineral supplements, but they seemed to view the arrival of new caretakers as an opportunity for general mischief. Their testing, Ivy explained, as Luna attempted to eat the sleeve of Verena's jacket while Estrella investigated the contents of her purse. "Once they decide you're reliable, they'll settle down." By the end of the first day, Verena was exhausted in ways she hadn't experienced since the early days of caring for Elias during his illness, but there was something deeply satisfying about the physical tiredness that came from useful work. from caring for creatures who depended on her competence and consistency. More importantly, the daily drives to Ruth's property were becoming a meditation on landscape and season. The high desert revealed different aspects of itself at morning and evening. The way light caught the red rocks differently at dawn than at dusk, how the mountains seemed to change color throughout the day, the subtle signs of winter's approach in the behavior of wild animals and the turning of hidden springs. Ashby, perhaps sensing the additional stress in their household, seemed to rally in response to the crisis. His mobility continued to improve, and he began showing signs of wanting to protect the expanded family that now included farm animals 45 minutes away. When Ivy reported on the day's activities, he listened with the attention of a concerned relative, occasionally offering small sounds that seemed remarkably like commentary. Even Esperanza appeared to understand that their normal routine had been disrupted for important reasons. She took over supervisory duties for Ashby's evening care, settling beside him during his medication time and grooming his ears with extra attention, as if compensating for Verina's divided focus. But it was the evening of the fourth day that provided the most remarkable evidence of how deeply their healing community had taken root. Verena arrived at Ruth's property to find Miguel Torres, Ruth's neighbor, waiting with a young woman she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Martinez," Miguel said, "this is my daughter, Helena. She heard about what you've been doing for Ruth and she wanted to help." Elena, a veterinary technician who worked at a large animal practice in Española, had driven over after her shift to check on the animals and had noticed that Cielo seemed slightly off his feed. "It's probably nothing serious," she said, "but with horses his age, even small changes can be significant. I brought some appetite stimulant from our clinic, and I thought maybe we should call your veterinarian friend to take a look." What followed was an impromptu conference call with Dr. Vasquez, who listened to Elena's assessment and agreed that a precautionary examination would be wise. An hour later, she arrived at Ruth's property with a mobile examination kit, transforming the small barn into a temporary clinic. Cielo's examination revealed the early stages of a digestive issue that could have become serious if left untreated. Dr. Vasquez prescribed medication and adjusted his diet, but she also took time to teach Verena and Elena how to monitor his condition going forward. "This is exactly what Ruth would want," Dr. Vasquez said as they prepared to leave. "Animals being cared for by people who are paying attention, asking for help when they need it, and creating a network of support that ensures nothing falls through the cracks." That night, as Verena sat in her living room with Ashby at her feet and Esperanza purring in her lap, she reflected on how completely her understanding of community had changed. 6 months ago, her world had contracted to the size of her grief. Now it had expanded to include not just her immediate household, but a network of people and animals whose well-being was intertwined with her own. But the week was about to deliver one final test of their collective resilience, one that would reveal just how deep the roots of their healing community had grown. The phone call came at midnight, waking her from the deep sleep that comes after days of useful exhaustion. It was Miguel Torres, his voice tight with worry. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm sorry to call so late, but there's been an accident. A drunk driver hit a deer on the road to Ruth's place, and the deer wandered onto her property, badly injured. Elena's here, but we need help. The animal is suffering and we don't know what to do." Verena looked at Ashby, who had lifted his head at the sound of the phone, his amber eyes alert and questioning. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the first real storm of the winter, turning the familiar roads treacherous and uncertain. "I'll be right there," she said, already reaching for her clothes. Sometimes the tests life sends us aren't about our own strength, but about our willingness to step into the unknown when others need us. As Verena prepared to drive through a snowstorm to help with an emergency she felt completely unqualified to handle, she realized that the woman who had walked into that veterinary clinic 3 months ago wouldn't have made this call, wouldn't have seen herself as someone others could depend on in a crisis. But that woman no longer existed. In her place was someone who had learned that healing happens in community, that strength grows through practice, and that love is not just a feeling but a series of actions taken when the outcome is uncertain, but the need is clear. The storm was just beginning, but she was no longer afraid of the dark. The drive to Ruth's property that night was a journey through a world transformed by winter's first real storm. Snow fell steadily, reducing visibility, and making the familiar roads feel foreign and dangerous. Verena gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her headlights carving a small tunnel of visibility through the swirling darkness. Ashby had insisted on coming along, somehow understanding that this was not a routine evening trip. He sat in the back seat with unusual alertness, occasionally whimpering softly as if sensing the urgency in the air. Verena found his presence both comforting and worrying. If something happened to her on these treacherous roads, what would become of him? At Ruth's property, the scene was more chaotic than Miguel's phone call had conveyed. The injured deer lay near the goat enclosure, its breathing labored and its left hind leg bent at an unnatural angle. Elena was kneeling beside it, her veterinary training evident in her calm assessment of its condition, but her face showed the strain of someone dealing with a situation beyond her usual expertise. "Thank you for coming," Miguel said as Verena carefully made her way across the snow-covered ground. "We called the state wildlife office, but they said they can't get anyone out here until morning, and—" He gestured helplessly toward the deer. "It's suffering." Elena looked up from her examination, her young face grave. "The leg is definitely broken, probably from the initial impact with the car, but there might be internal injuries too. I can see signs of shock. And its breathing is getting shallower." Verena knelt beside the deer, close enough to see the fear in its dark eyes. She had encountered injured wildlife before during her years with Elias, rabbits caught by cats, birds that had flown into windows, but nothing on this scale. The deer was a young doe, probably 2 or 3 years old, with the kind of delicate beauty that made its current suffering feel particularly tragic. "What are our options?" she asked Elena. "Honestly, in a fully equipped, large animal hospital we might be able to save her, but here in these conditions—" Elena's voice trailed off. "The most humane thing might be to end her suffering." The words hung in the cold air like a challenge. Verena thought about that morning in the veterinary clinic, when Dr. Vasquez had been prepared to end Ashby's suffering. How different would their lives be now if she hadn't stepped forward, if she hadn't been willing to try something that seemed impossible? "What if we got her to a veterinary hospital?" she asked. "How would we do that?" Miguel and Elena exchanged glances. "Mrs. Martinez," Miguel said gently, "the nearest large animal facility is in Albuquerque, over an hour away in good weather. In this storm, with an injured deer. And we don't have equipment to transport her safely," Elena added. "Moving her could cause more damage, and the stress alone might kill her." Verena looked at the deer again, then at Ashby, who had somehow gotten out of the car and was standing at a respectful distance, watching the scene with the solemn attention of an animal who understood suffering. Something about his presence sparked a memory. "Elena," she said suddenly, "do you have Dr. Vasquez's emergency number?" The phone call, made from Miguel's kitchen while snow continued to pile up outside, was one of the more surreal conversations of Verena's life. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm sorry to call so late, but we have an emergency at Ruth's place. An injured deer. Probably needs euthanasia, but—" She found herself explaining the situation, the storm, their isolation, and her growing certainty that there had to be another option. "Verena," Dr. Vasquez said when she finished, "I appreciate that you want to help, but large animal emergency medicine isn't something we can improvise, and in a snowstorm, what if you could walk Elena through it over the phone?" Verena pressed. "She's a licensed veterinary technician, she has some medical supplies with her, and there might be things in Ruth's house, herbs, equipment that could help." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Verena wondered if the call had been dropped. Then Dr. Vasquez spoke, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone agreeing to something that violated most professional protocols. "If Eleanor is willing to take direction, and if we can stabilize the deer enough to get through the night, I could try to arrange transport to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in the morning. But Verena, the chances of success are very small." "Sometimes small chances are enough," Verena replied, thinking of Ashby. What followed was the most intense 3 hours of Verena's life since Elias's final night in the hospital. Elena, guided by Dr. Vasquez's calm voice through speakerphone, administered pain medication and stabilized the deer's broken leg with improvised splinting materials found in Ruth's surprisingly well-equipped workshop. Verena found herself serving as assistant, following Elena's instructions to hold the deer steady, monitor its breathing, and fetch supplies from Ruth's extensive collection of healing herbs. Ruth's kitchen revealed itself to be a natural pharmacy, with carefully labeled jars of plants that Elena, with Dr. Vasquez's guidance, was able to identify and use for their anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving properties. Miguel proved invaluable as well, his ranching experience providing practical knowledge about animal handling and his calm presence helping to keep the deer from panicking further. Even Ashby seemed to understand his role, staying close enough to provide moral support, but far enough away to avoid adding stress to an already chaotic situation. By 2 in the morning, the deer was breathing more easily and seemed to be resting comfortably in the small shelter they had created using hay bales and tarps. Eleanor had managed to start an IV for fluid support, and the combination of conventional pain medication and Ruth's herbal preparations seemed to be providing significant relief. "I can't believe this is working," Elena said, settling back on her heels and looking at their improvised wildlife hospital with amazement. Dr. Vasquez's voice came through the phone, tired but cautiously optimistic. "I've contacted the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, and they'll send a transport team as soon as the roads are clear. You've done excellent work, all of you." But their night was far from over. As they settled in to monitor the deer through the remaining hours until dawn, Verena began to feel the accumulated stress of the past week catching up with her. The combination of physical exhaustion, emotional strain, and adrenaline created a fatigue deeper than anything she had experienced since those final weeks of caring for Elias. It was Ashby who noticed first. As Verena sat against a hay bale, supposedly resting while Eleanor monitored the deer's vital signs, he approached and gently nudged her arm. When she looked at him, his amber eyes held the kind of concern she had seen in them during his worst days, when he had been the one needing care. "I'm fine," she told him automatically, but even as she said it, she realized it wasn't true. Her chest felt tight, her breathing was shallow, and the world seemed to be acquiring a strange, distant quality that she recognized from her own medical history. "Eleanor," she said quietly, not wanting to alarm anyone but knowing she needed help, "I think I might be having some kind of episode." Eleanor was beside her immediately, her veterinary training adapting easily to human physiology. She checked Verena's pulse, observed her breathing, and asked the kind of quick professional questions that revealed both competence and concern. "Miguel, we need to call an ambulance," she said after a few moments of assessment. "Mrs. Martinez is showing signs of cardiac stress, probably exhaustion and anxiety, but we need to get her checked out properly." "No," Verena protested, thinking of the deer, of Ashby, of all the responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned. "I just need to rest for a few minutes." "Mrs. Martinez," Eleanor said firmly, her young voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to make difficult medical decisions. "You've been running on adrenaline for days. You've had an incredibly stressful night, and your body is telling you it needs help. We're calling for medical assistance." The next few hours passed in a blur of emergency. Responders navigating snow-covered roads, medical assessments conducted by flashlight, and the surreal experience of being loaded into an ambulance while worrying about a deer, a dog, and the goats who would need their morning feeding. At the hospital, the diagnosis was exhaustion complicated by cardiac arrhythmia, serious enough to require monitoring, but not immediately life-threatening. Dr. Chen, the same physician who had treated Ruth, explained that the combination of stress, fatigue, and emotional overload had simply overwhelmed Verena's system. "You're going to be fine," she assured Verena as she settled into a hospital bed remarkably similar to the one Ruth had occupied a week earlier. "But you need rest, real rest, not the kind where you're worrying about everyone and everything in your care." "But Ashby," Verena began, "and the animals at Ruth's place are being taken care of," Dr. Chen interrupted gently. "Your friend Elena called to report that the deer was successfully transported to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center this morning, and she's arranged for continued care of the other animals. Your dog is with someone named Naomi, and everything that needs attention is getting it." The relief that flooded through Verena was so profound it was almost overwhelming. For months she had been the person others depended on, the one who stepped forward when help was needed. She had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for, to have others take responsibility when she couldn't. Over the next 2 days, as she rested in the hospital and allowed her body to recover from months of accumulated stress, Verena received visitors who revealed the true extent of the community that had grown around their shared commitment to healing. Naomi brought Ashby for a brief visit, and his obvious joy at seeing her was matched by his clear contentment with his temporary living arrangements. "He's been helping me with my yoga classes," Naomi reported with a smile. "Apparently he has a natural talent for assisting with relaxation techniques." Elena stopped by to report that the deer was recovering well at the wildlife center and would likely be released back to the wild within a few weeks. "They said it was the best emergency field treatment they'd ever seen for that kind of injury," she said proudly. Dr. Vasquez visited to check on Verina's recovery and to share something unexpected. "What happened that night has been getting attention in the veterinary community. Where you organized resources and created an emergency response team using local knowledge and remote consultation, it's being discussed as a model for rural animal emergency care. Even Mr. Peterson made the trip to the hospital, bringing flowers and the kind of gentle wisdom that comes from a lifetime of experience with setbacks and recoveries. You know," he said, as he settled into the visitor's chair, "when I had to make that decision about Ashby, I thought it was an ending. I never imagined it. It was really a beginning, not just for him but for all of us. But the most meaningful visit came from Ruth herself, who had been released from the hospital the day before and insisted on coming despite her own ongoing recovery. "You saved my animals," she said simply. "But more than that, you proved something I've always believed, that healing is a community practice. What you created that night, bringing together veterinary medicine, traditional knowledge, local resources, and simple determination. That's how real healing has always happened." As Verina prepared to go home after 3 days of enforced rest, she reflected on how completely her understanding of strength had changed. 6 months ago, she had thought strength meant handling everything alone, never asking for help, maintaining control even when control was impossible. Now she understood that real strength meant building community, accepting help, and trusting others to continue the work when you couldn't. The ride home with Ashby beside her and Esperanza waiting at the window felt like a return to a place that had been transformed by her absence. The house no longer felt like a refuge from the world, but like a headquarters for engagement with it, a place where healing happened not in isolation, but in connection with a wider web of care and commitment. But the most remarkable transformation was yet to come. As Verina settled back into her daily routine of caring for Ashby and gradually resumed her responsibilities, she began to notice something extraordinary. Their small circle of healing had rippled outward in ways none of them had anticipated, touching lives and inspiring actions throughout their community in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. The woman who had walked into that veterinary clinic to pick up cat medicine had become someone else entirely, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of small acts of courage that had gradually revealed capabilities she never knew she possessed. And the best part she was beginning to realize was that the story was far from over. Spring arrived in Santa Fe with the kind of tentative beauty that makes every green shoot feel like a small miracle. As Verina knelt in her backyard garden, planting tomatoes and herbs with Ashby supervising from his favorite sunny spot, she could hardly believe that a year had passed since that life-changing morning in the veterinary clinic. Ashby, now sporting a sleek coat and moving with confidence that would have seemed impossible 12 months earlier, had claimed the role of neighborhood ambassador. Children stopped by after school to visit him, neighbors sought updates on his condition during their evening walks, and other pet owners approached Verina for advice about holistic care for their own animals. But the most remarkable change wasn't in Ashby's condition. It was in the community that had grown around his recovery. What had started as a few people helping one dog had evolved into something no one had planned but everyone had embraced, an informal network of animal care and community support that was quietly transforming how their corner of Santa Fe thought about healing, aging, and mutual aid. Ruth, fully recovered from her pneumonia and energized by her forced period of rest, had partnered with Dr. Vasquez to offer monthly workshops on integrating traditional herbal knowledge with conventional veterinary care. The sessions, held at the Animal Clinic, drew participants from across northern New Mexico, ranchers, pet owners, veterinary technicians, and traditional healers who found common ground in their commitment to animal welfare. Naomi had expanded her aquatherapy practice to include other dogs with mobility issues, and her converted studio had become an unofficial center for what people were calling community-based animal wellness. She was currently working with Elena Torres, who had decided to return to school to become a veterinarian herself, inspired by that snowy night when they had saved the deer. Ivy, who had completed her veterinary degree and accepted a position with Dr. Monroe's practice in Denver, made monthly trips to Santa Fe to document the ongoing success of what academic papers were now calling the Santa Fe model of community-centered animal care. "What you've created here," she told Verena during her most recent visit, "is being studied by veterinary schools and animal welfare organizations across the country. You've proven that healing happens best when it's supported by community, and that community forms naturally around shared commitment to care." Even Mr. Peterson had found new purpose in the network they had created. Unable to care for a dog himself due to his limited mobility, he had become the unofficial coordinator of pet visits for elderly residents of his apartment complex. Several afternoons a week, he could be found in the community room with Ashby and other therapy animals, facilitating connections between isolated seniors and four-legged companions who seemed to understand exactly what kind of healing was needed. But perhaps the most unexpected development was the friendship that had bloomed between Ashby and Esperanza. The calico cat, who had once ruled their household with imperious independence, had discovered the joys of collaboration. She had appointed herself Ashby's personal groomer, physical therapist, and emotional support advisor. Visitors often found them curled together in the sunny spot by the living room window, looking like an advertisement for interspecies cooperation. The formal recognition of their work came in late spring, when the New Mexico Veterinary Medical Association announced that Verena would receive their annual award for outstanding contribution to animal welfare by a non-veterinarian. "I don't deserve an award," Verena protested when Dr. Vasquez called with the news. "I just helped one dog." "You helped one dog," Dr. Vasquez replied, "and in doing so you created a model for community care that's helping animals and people across the state. You're going to accept this award, and you're going to let people thank you for showing them what's possible." The award ceremony, held at the beautiful La Fonda Hotel in downtown Santa Fe, drew an audience that reflected the breadth of the community that had grown around Ashby's recovery. Veterinarians sat next to traditional healers, animal rescue, volunteers mingled with academic researchers, and pet owners from across New Mexico came to celebrate the idea that healing could happen in ways that strengthened entire communities. Verena's acceptance speech was brief, heartfelt, and characteristically focused on everyone except herself. "A year ago, I was a woman whose world had shrunk to the size of her grief. I walked into a veterinary clinic to pick up cat medicine and walked out with a dying dog and a second chance at living. What happened after that wasn't heroic or extraordinary. It was just people doing what people do when they see a need and decide to help. But what I've learned is that healing is contagious. When we create conditions for one creature to get better, we create conditions for everyone to get better. When we build community around care, we discover that we're all stronger than we thought, more capable than we imagined, and more connected than we dared to hope. This award doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every person who has ever looked at suffering and decided to step forward instead of step away. It belongs to Dr. Vasquez, who trusted a stranger with a generous impulse, to Ruth, who shares the wisdom of traditional healing, to Naomi, who opened her home and her heart to aquatherapy, to Elena and Ivy and Dr. Monroe and Mr. Peterson and countless others who have shown that healing happens in community. And it belongs to Ashby, who taught us that sometimes the best way to save your own life is to let yourself be saved by others. As the audience rose in applause, Verena looked out at faces that had become dear to her over the past year. She saw people who had started as strangers and become family, bound together by their shared commitment to the radical idea that love could overcome almost any obstacle if it was supported by community, sustained by hope, and expressed through action. After the ceremony, as people lingered over coffee and conversation, Verena found herself in the hotel courtyard with Ashby, who had been permitted to attend as guest of honor. The evening was warm and clear, with the kind of desert sky that makes you believe in infinite possibilities. "You know what, Ashby?" she said, scratching behind his ears as he leaned contentedly against her legs. "I think we did all right." His tail wagged in agreement, and he looked up at her with those amber eyes that had started everything. eyes that no longer held pain or resignation, but confidence and the kind of peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. The drive home took them through the plaza, past the palace of the governors, where they had taken so many walks during Ashby's recovery. The ancient buildings glowed in the evening light, looking much the same as they had for centuries, but Verena saw them differently now. They were no longer just historic landmarks, but witnesses to the ongoing story of human connection, resilience, and the endless capacity for renewal. At home, Esperanza greeted them at the door with the satisfaction of a cat who had spent the evening holding down the fort. She had claimed Verena's favorite chair and showed no inclination to move, clearly intending to supervise the evening routine with the authority of someone who had been running things long before dogs and awards and community networks had complicated their peaceful household. That night, as Verena settled into bed with Esperanza purring on one side and Ashby dreaming on his bed, nearby she thought about the phone call that would come tomorrow from a woman in Phoenix whose elderly dog had been diagnosed with the same condition Ashby had faced. Word of their success had spread beyond New Mexico, and people were reaching out for guidance, hope, and sometimes just the reassurance that someone understood what they were going through. She had become, without planning or expecting it, someone others turned to in crisis. The woman who had once felt invisible and useless had discovered she had knowledge worth sharing, experience worth passing on, and a capacity for helping that seemed to grow stronger the more it was used. But more than that, she had learned that healing wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you participated in, something you created in collaboration with others, something that rippled outward in ways you could never predict or control. The dog who was supposed to have died that October morning was sleeping peacefully beside her. Bed, his breathing steady and strong, his body relaxed with the confidence of an animal who knows he is safe and loved. But he wasn't the only one who had been saved in that examination room. The woman who had been dying slowly of loneliness and purposelessness had also been rescued that day. Not by dramatic intervention, but by the gradual recognition that life always offers second chances to those brave enough to step forward when love calls. As she drifted off to sleep, Verena's last, conscious thought was of gratitude, not just for Ashby's recovery or for the community they had built, or even for the award that recognized their work. She was grateful for the reminder that every ending contains the seeds of a new beginning, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply say yes when life offers you the chance to love something back to wholeness. Outside, Santa Fe settled into another peaceful night, unaware that in countless homes across the city and beyond, people were caring for animals with a little more hope, a little more community support, and a lot more faith in the possibility that healing really could happen when people decided to work together towards something greater than themselves. The gentle revival they had started with one dying dog had become something larger than any of them had imagined, a quiet revolution of care that would continue to ripple outward long after their individual stories had become part of the larger story of how communities heal when they discover the courage to love without limits. In the morning, there would be new challenges, new animals to help, new connections to nurture. But tonight, in the peaceful darkness of a house filled with love and purpose, it was enough to rest in the knowledge that they had learned the most important lesson life has to teach, that we save ourselves by saving each other, and that hope, once unleashed, is impossible to contain. The dog, who was already condemned, had changed. Everything in seconds, but the seconds had stretched into minutes, the minutes into hours, the hours into days, and the days into a lifetime of proof that miracles happen when ordinary people decide to step forward and love something back to life. My friends, we've come to the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you bring to life from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.